First of all, it would not be the first time I contradicted myself, but in this case, it was not about regime change. I was in favor of changing the regime because Saddam Hussein was a brutal, masochistic tyrant who murdered tens of thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of people, who had every intention of handing the regime over to his sons, who arguably were even worse. But we would not have gone into Iraq if Saddam had presented convincing evidence that he did not possess weapons of mass destruction, and he failed to do that.
Though you would have liked to have him overthrown, regardless of...
Well, I was in favor of...
You've been arguing since the late 90s.
Yes, but what I had always argued was that we should do it by political means, by working with his internal opponents, and we didn't do that.
Right.
And so we had no option.
But Richard Paul Wolfowitz, who you know well, said, when asked about weapons of mass destruction, said this was the only thing we could all agree on, so it was convenient.
That's the woman in the centre there.
As an excuse.
We'll go on to another question. Yes.
Hi. Would the panel agree that with 9/11 that America used what happened to hype the capabilities and the intelligence of Al-Qaeda, as Tariq mentioned earlier, with the IRA, in comparison, you know, there wasn't this as much hype and everything with the IRA. Sorry, I can't even speak.
That's all right. You mean Al-Qaeda wasn't the kind of threat that it was made out to be?
Yes, exactly.
Do you agree with that, David?
I think the lady's making a really important point. I don't
you believe her or not? Agree with her?
I don't think there was hype, but I think it's very important to recognise now that 9/11 looks like the high point of Al-Qaeda. It didn't look like that at the time, though. And remember, 11 airliners could have been blown up over the Atlantic in 2006. They were foiled by very careful intelligence. So even to the present day, there are people trying to commit murder and mayhem on our streets and on the streets throughout the Middle East. However, and in parts of Africa as well. So I don't think it was hype. However, in retrospect, I think you can now see, and hindsight is not something that you're blessed with in politics, but you can now see as a matter of analysis that certainly after the bombing of the Jordan wedding in 2005, when 55 Muslims were killed by Al-Qaeda, but actually even further back than that, the high point was probably 2001. One other point though, it's not the IRA. This is a bigger and more different threat than the IRA. We had experience of the IRA, but they did not propagate a global vision. They did not have the kind of global reach and the theological basis that Al-Qaeda tried to engage with. And that's one further reason why be wary of the words like hype. This was different, it was dangerous, it had shown its potential in the 90s in a series of incidents. And so those who were on red alert on those days were absolutely right to be on red alert.
Now, hold on a second. I thought we'd come to it later, perhaps, but it's clearly relevant from what you said. You talk about the 11 planes whose bombing was prevented by information which it's generally accepted was obtained by torture. By waterboarding techniques with Sheikh Mohammed.
I'm sorry, that is just not right, David. Because look, there are a million people watching this programme.
Dick Cheney says that in his book, which was published today.
But look, the British, unusually, British government, not when I was in office, but when President Bush said this at a book launch of his in, I think, Texas, British government put out a statement saying that this was not the case. And it is an absolutely fundamental principle.
Well, how do you know it wasn't the case? Well, you don't know how the information reached you. Because you say the British government was not involved in torture.
Correct.
Fair enough. But information reaches you. You don't know how it's been acquired.
What I would say to you is that this case has been made by people on the hard right of American politics and the hard right of the administration. And what they've said is, look, you in Europe and in Britain, you say you'll never countenance waterboarding and torture. I think it's right that we say not just that it's morally abhorrent, but that it's illegal to torture people. But their argument in return is to say, but we got the information from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in respect to the 2006 plots. The British intelligence services, uniquely, because they never comment, felt it was right to say, while all sorts of information has come out from all sorts of sources, It's not the case that those 2006 airliner plots were prevented as a result of torture.
On the other hand, you did write as Foreign Secretary that where there is reliable intelligence bearing directly on threats, it would be irresponsible to reject it out of hand. And presumably that means reject it out of hand however it had been obtained.
Well, the classic ticking time bomb issue is if you find out that there's a bomb on the tube, do you act on it or not? Now, that is different from the fact that, as far as I'm concerned, it's illegal in national and international law, never mind morally reprehensible. And I'd make one other point, because I've thought about this a lot. Look, John McCain is not on my side of the political spectrum, but he said, remember, when you start talking about torturing people, you're actually harming us more than you're harming them. And you're putting our values and what we stand for in grave danger, and I agree with him.
All right. We're talking tonight about the consequences of 9/11, and this issue is one of them. I go to the man up there, and then I come to you, Liam Fox, and Tariq, if you want to come in. Yes. Yes, you, sir, with your hand in the air.
Yeah, we've heard all about what Al-Qaeda have done and what their threat is, but what we don't usually hear about is why they did it. What are their grievances? And can we address those grievances? Wouldn't that be a better way forward?
Tariq Ali.
Well, the grievances, look, all terrorist groups, whatever their origins, whether they're 19th century anarchists, whether they're 20th century groups in Germany and Italy in the 60s, have their grievances. That is not a problem at all, and this group did. And its grievances, if you read bin Laden's texts, are very clear that my world is occupied by your countries and their troops. The question is, many Arab people have these grievances, but this is not the way they go and fight them. There are other ways of doing it. So it is the fact that the grievances are there, and it is not even the case that these grievances are not recognized, because people talk about the United Nations passing resolutions against Saddam. The United Nations has passed resolutions against other countries as well, including Israel, including the right of the Palestinians to self-determination. They've passed resolutions against India on Kashmir. So which resolutions are taken up is actually determined by the United States, which is why I say that this form of selective vigilantism doesn't work. It ends up badly, as we saw in Iraq and as we are now watching in Afghanistan and probably Libya too.
Can I bring you back to the torture issue, Liam Fox, briefly? And then
I think, first of all, I very much agree with David on this question. I mean, what we do says who we are, and we have to apply our own ethics and values. But on this question of grievances, let's be very careful about moral equivalence here. What sort of grievance and what sort of response to any grievance is it to fly aeroplanes into heavily populated buildings?
No, I agree.
And as for this idea that the response to what was mass murder was some sort of American hype, this was one area where the United Nations did act together, where the United Nations came together and sanctioned the creation of ISAF, where we have 49 countries still there today. So let's not be misled by the rewriting of that particular history. This was a savage, vicious murder by people who had absolutely no reason to do so.
Right. Well, I'm
okay,
going
but
to
once you've had your revenge, what do we do now? It's 10 years of the war in Afghanistan as well.
Well, this is what we'll move on to in a moment. But before I do, take another question, just to say, if you're on Twitter tonight, want to take part in the debate, remember our hashtag is BBCQT. Text us 83981, CFAX page 155 will show you what others are texting, and if you're watching digitally, press the red button. I'd like to take a question from Rizwana Ahmed, please.
I'd like to ask, what evidence is there that engaging in costly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan has actually ensured the safety of the average British person?
Have the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan ensured the safety of the ordinary British citizen? Bonnie Greer?
Well, that was what we were sold when the Prime Minister of the day, Tony Blair, stood up and said that we were in imminent danger from weapons of mass destruction. I remember that vividly. And 1 million people came out on the streets of this country and said, "Not in my name," and they were completely ignored by the government of the day. So That is a valid question. And the question on the floor tonight is what is the aftermath of what happened? And we mustn't get away from that, because what you're asking is a very important question. What does it have to do with me? Does it make my life safer on this street? And I believe that the former head of MI5 has said in her Wreath lectures that, in fact, she said before we went in that we would actually endanger the homeland, the United Kingdom, if we took this action. She said that, and she's saying it and saying it and saying it.
Did you, Dave Miliband, did you get that information from MI5, which Baroness Manningham-Buller has made public in her Wreath lectures? She advised the government Britain would be less safe?
Not in that way, no. And I think one golden...
She says that the war was likely to increase the domestic threat and was, I quote her words, a distraction from the pursuit of Al-Qaeda.
Let's go through it carefully.
Did she say that to you?
No, I was the junior education minister at the time,
right,
so so she certainly didn't say it to me. But I think one golden rule for this is, let's not put Afghanistan and Iraq in the same paragraph, never mind the same sentence. Tariq is raising a really important point, 10 years in Afghanistan. My own view is it was essential to depose the Taliban from Kabul. I think there was a tragic mistake in late 2002 when in the southeast of Afghanistan those who were many Taliban supporters had a choice. Could they come into the political system or would they be driven out? And I'm afraid the new constitution that Afghanistan adopted led to them being driven out. The peace conference of 2002 was a conference only for the victors. And that was a tragic and terrible error. They went into Pakistan, they regrouped in 2005, they were back attacking our troops in Helmand province. So the Afghan story is one, in my view, where 80% of the work should have been done by politics and not by the military. In a counterinsurgency, it's 20% military, 80% politics. Iraq is a different story, and we can come to that and debate it in detail. But there is a pressing issue today, which is how is the Afghan conflict brought to a close?
But hang on a second. I must chair this. That we'll come to that. The question you were actually asked was, has what we've done in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past 10 years, and I quote, done anything to ensure the safety of the ordinary British citizen?
Well, there's no question in my mind that Al-Qaeda Central as it's called, is much weaker today than it was 10 years ago. That is simple fact. Now, is it as weak as it could have been if other things had been done? No. But Al-Qaeda Corps' ability to project violence around the world is less than it was 10 years ago. It's less than it was partly because of military operations, importantly, but also partly because millions of Muslims around the world have embraced political reform, not global jihad, as the way to pursue their interests. And I think that's key to this future.
Man up there at the back.
I think that as a people we are safe, but only at the cost of our soldiers who have been sent in to do the job. I think the fact that they've done a magnificent job doesn't hide the fact that they were sent in under-equipped. So we have to thank them for doing the job that politicians talk about, but don't do themselves. So we thank the soldiers for doing it, but we're safe because of them.
Liam Fox is Secretary of Defence. I want to answer the point. They were sent in under-equipped. And then do you believe that the
cops and body armour, as you read.
And was what has happened, what they've done, made this place safer?
Has it made not just us, but has it made the world safer? Yes, I believe it has. The point was made at the outset that 2001 was in fact the high point of Al-Qaeda. Well, there's a reason why it was the high point of Al-Qaeda, and that was the action we took as a consequence. And it wasn't just what happened in Manhattan on 9/11. Remember the Madrid train bombings. Remember what happened to the USS Cole. Remember the bombings in Kenya. All these were a pattern. Al-Qaeda was going to launch more attacks on the West. More innocent people were going to die. More 9/11s were going to happen. It was the duty of the governments at the time, it was the duty of the United Nations to act to protect the people from what was a wider threat. Now, in terms of what happened in Afghanistan, you could have a very long debate about it. But I think that it falls into three parts, 2001 to 2006. What happened between 2006 and 2009 and what happened after that. And I think for a long period of that, we were under-equipped, there was an insufficient troop density on the ground, and we miscalculated as a Western community through ISAF, I think exactly how creative and how resilient some of the elements of the Taliban could be. And I think that we paid a price in the later years for the military miscalculations in the early ones.
Okay. You sit in the front then.
Yeah, just three things. One is about the UN resolutions. I think Israel is on record to be the worst country to defy UN resolutions.